Hello, and welcome to the Argyle CFO Leadership Forum, FP&A Innovation for Growth. My name is Nick with Argyle, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. A couple of notes before I turn things over to our esteemed speaker. First, a quick reminder to stop by our sponsors' virtual booths at any time during today's event and for the following week. Our partners are committed to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. At any time during today's event, you can visit their virtual booths from the main agenda page, which include complimentary materials, information, and meet and greet opportunities. Throughout today's event, you will also have the opportunity to win one of several prizes. So be sure to check out the prizes and raffle rules tab of the interface to see how you can earn points. To ask questions throughout the session, simply type into the Q&A chat and we will address your questions at the end of the session. Now, without further delay, I would like to introduce our speaker, Michael Emerson, CTO, Extended Planning and Analysis, SAP. We're super excited to have Michael with us for a thought leadership presentation titled Finance Needs AI, but AI Needs Finance More. Welcome, Michael. Over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm super happy to be here and talk about this topic, which is a real passion of mine. There's been so much hype around AI, and especially in our area, in our business, where we're really trying to optimize future outcomes. It's really important to understand all the kind of interactions that take place in the business for us to learn how we can optimize the systems to help us optimize our business outcomes. Now, obviously, the topic is around how AI needs finance and planning. But I want to start by going over how we optimize an organization to achieve these outcomes. So really focusing on the planning part, and then we're going to get into the AI part. At the end, I'm going to block off around about 5 minutes for questions. If I can't answer all the questions in that short period of time, I will be following up, and you can reach out to me directly anytime, and I'm happy to answer any questions. So let's get started. Obviously, this is just basic definitions, right? What is it to be intelligent? What is it to be sustainable? What is planning? I think the important thing is to understand, intelligence is being able to react to an environment, right, and learn from that. And sustainability, right, is not just about environmental sustainability, which is of course important, but it's about ensuring sustainability of a business or a process over a period of time. And then planning, obviously, is then how do we do it? When do we do it? How do we organize? And how do we connect all the different areas of a business to achieve a plan? Now, the thing is, there's a lot of questions that come up to achieve a specific objective, right? That might be set at the executive level. So, we look through what's happened in the past and why has it happened, and we try and run analytics on it. And then as we move into the modeling process and then go through to looking and forecasting and planning, understand what should happen and why will it happen, there's so many questions that come. For example, what business data really makes sense? Are the right data structures in place? Do we have the right incentives for people to align to these objectives? And many, many other questions. And the thing is that what happens is these enterprise objectives that are set at a high level typically get obscured with disconnected data, logic, and process. Now, a very simplistic example would be, for example, finance might be looking to drive return on investment, digital supply chain, optimizing inventory, managing COGS, etc. Customer resource management, looking at driving top-line growth, whereas human capital management might be looking at just simply hiring the best people. And there might be conflicts of interest as you set KPIs across the organization, as you break apart the whole enterprise objective. So how do we align this, right? So the steps towards an intelligent enterprise are, firstly, creating that transparency in the operational level. And that's why we have ERP. I mean, after all, enterprise resource planning, that's what it stands for. You're planning, but it's for today, right? It's the present quarter. You're looking at optimizing your operations for the objectives that you need to set today. And it doesn't help us so much achieving our future enterprise objectives. So actually, the natural progression from there was to build out planning solutions along each line of business. And that's why we have demand supply planning tools, workforce planning, etc., and financial planning, of course. But these are all disconnected plans in the future. And the problem is when we change one area of the plan, we don't understand the impact in the other areas. So that's why we've created these connected planning interfaces so that we can understand any change of plan in one area and how it propagates across the different planning areas. And the important thing is it then provides that transparency across an organization from both the data perspective, a process perspective, and logic. And that's really, really important, especially as we start trying to think about how we design intelligent systems to then be able to react to those out-of-bound events that would have a heavy impact on our plan and execution. So, and that also helps us to align, moving from strategy to tactical to operational planning to execution. Because obviously when you're setting your future sales targets, your financial plans, the unconstrained plan, and then you try to map what's already in the agreed plan or the constrained plan. For example, how much do you have in inventory? What are your supplier agreements? Like, what are your payment terms? All these things, these constraints have to be aligned. And another important thing about transparency is the connectivity between your future view to your operational view. And this creates this loop from your plan to execution and then round and round again. And it creates this cause and effect loop, which is super important for building AI and machine learning models so that we can actually optimize the outcomes based on historical experience. So what are the technical requirements? And why have we not been able to deliver these connected plans and intelligent systems before? Well, we're very lucky now because we've overcome a lot of the technical limitations. In the last 10 years, how we manage data, we now have in-memory databases, we have cloud-native solutions where we have scalability of individual services. All of these things have actually freed us to be able to break some of these constraints, right? Especially around when you're handling huge amounts of data and you're having to run very complex algorithms across these very dynamic data sets. Then there's the organic development. And as I showed, we had these dedicated planning areas and they've developed tools for specific planning users. So you typically have, an FP&A hat or a demand supply planning hat, and they have very specific tasks. But these planning tools have been developed completely independently without thinking about the other areas. Now we have to think about it more holistically and how we can adapt these applications to really understand each other and the impacts they have. And then that's kind of from that, you get these legacy processes where we have these stupid yearly plans. And then you have to, for example, when I used to work in banking and I had a budget for my infrastructure, I had to essentially spend on infrastructure I didn't need to make sure that I had it for the year when I really did need it, and just silly things like this. And now the processes are changing. We can actually make it much, much more efficient and cost effective. Now, in terms of as I said, the key factor when designing these intelligent planning systems is the transparency, as I said, between data, logic, and process. And when it comes to the planning stack, it needs to be able to build models upon models. And what I mean is that every model, for example, it would be a financial planning model and you have a demand supply planning model, will need to be able to have views where you can look at it from any perspective, which means typically you needing to build a model on top of those that can then combine different dimensions across these different areas. On top of that, we need to ensure that the planning logic is exposed to not just one particular area of the business, but can actually be exposed to other areas of the business to understand impacts of changes of plan, which then can be propagated into the data and then reflected in the processes and the applications above. And then importantly, there needs to be a level in terms of the UX where we can share these different changes and plans across the different lines of business with a clear view of understanding what the impact would be to that high level enterprise objective, while at the same time keeping track of our kind of localized managerial KPIs. And, just to give a very basic example, from a financial point of view, you might be looking at by quarter. A supply view, you might be looking at by week. And clearly, there needs to be some kind of allocation models to be able to align, for example, the quarters to the weeks, because obviously Monday doesn't always fall on the first day of the quarter. And this is important for when we're building these models for AI, right? It's really important that we have this understanding of how to allocate, how to build these rules so that the visibility not just for the end users in the process, but also the visibility into the models that we're building. And there are a lot of traditional AI use cases, such as predictive forecasting, simulation, demand sensing, that can all feed into a global optimization engine using kind of more, they say not generative AI, but more of the classical classification regression approaches to machine learning, which is still very, very important, right? Despite all the hype around generative AI, the classical approaches are still very important for specific AI tasks, right? Use the right tool for the right job. But then on top of that, we can then start building natural language assistants, natural language queries on top of these models to then provide the next generation of AI use cases on top. So automating a lot of the planning processes and financial processes, such as modeling, building dashboards, optimizing processes, doing better planning and analysis, all of these things can be utilized as we build up the stack. And having that transparency is super, super important. And it's not like generative AI replaces, as I said, some of the kind of the value that the traditional statistics machine learning brings. It's just that additional add, right? And generative AI, I like to think of it as that, that friend who doesn't know everything, but you can provide a little bit of extra information. You don't need to retrain that friend every single time to then get some value out. And I'm explaining that in a little bit more detail by explaining why AI needs finance and planning. Now, generative AI needs foundational models, right? And these foundational models are built on text, image, speech, structured data, unstructured data. And this is a huge amount of information. As I said, it's like having an intelligent friend, but doesn't necessarily know everything. And the important thing in the business, right, is to be able to provide context when we're querying these foundational models. And this is where adaptation is so important for business AI. It's about getting the prompts right. It's about embedding internal knowledge and the right type of domain knowledge into the prompts that are then going to these foundational models, and then fine-tuning based on the outputs you get. And this is so important, right? Because context is everything, especially when we're trying to achieve these enterprise objectives. And it's about how do we represent the data, the process, and the logic as we're embedding this into the model, into the prompt engineering that we need to then send to these foundational models. So let's take an example. Why does AI need finance and planning so much? And the reason is that everything starts and ends with finance. So let's take, for example, the balance sheet. It gives us a snapshot in time of where our business is at. And then we run through a period, and then we get another snapshot, and then we go another period, and then we get another snapshot. And in between these snapshots, right, we can understand all the different processes that are happening, the changes in the data, whether it's in the general ledger, the material ledger, in payroll information, the processes that are then affecting that data. And then as you go through the closing process and you're generating your cash flow statement, and you can then get a consolidated ledger, all this information can then be embedded to really understand how we can optimize. And as I said, the important thing is understanding the connection between your plan and your operational data so that you can understand the cause and effect. So what we do is we can learn from each different area. So whether it's the process or the data, if we start by process, we can track performance benchmarks. We can look at transactional execution, the additional commentary or process notes that are actually added as additional information. And then we can embed that into a knowledge graph. And the knowledge graph is so important because it's a representation of the interactions within the business. And it's much better. Let's say a machine learning model can understand a knowledge graph, especially once we embed it into a vector engine. It can understand these relationships between the processes and the logic and all these different business objects that we have to then help us optimize in the future and optimize future workflows. And that goes for the data. And this is why it's so important that we have aligned data from a future perspective and a current perspective. So for example, we want to ensure that we have the same data structures and master data, for example, that we have in our planning models, that we have in our operational systems. So that the general ledger structure, for example, take your chart of accounts, we have the same pieces, same structures in place so that we can keep that link between, that cause and effect, and then learn from it so that we can optimize our outputs accordingly. And then also we can explore these different and simulate much more accurately future outcomes based on external factors or internal factors, or doing simulations on incentives, or so many other variables that can then more accurately understand what the impact would be and the impact to different areas of the business. And with retrieval augmented generation, which is the embedding, making sure that the prompts are accurate, what we can do is we can take this data and we embed it into a vector, because that's essentially what foundational models understand. They understand vectors, right? And we can then use that to improve the queries that are then going to a foundational model, so that they're getting business context applied to the question, so that we're getting accurate responses back, right? And this is why finance and planning is so important, because it provides that foundation in business knowledge graphs, in business vectors, which are then passed to actually get proper answers back. Because otherwise you're just going to get complete gibberish coming back from a foundational model, because it doesn't understand your business. And getting your business context embedded into these knowledge graphs and vector engines is so important. And these vector usage patterns are used in so many different use cases, whether it's anomaly detection, classification, recommendations, or even doing advanced queries across the business. It's used in so many different areas. And the speed that you can get and the benefit is absolutely huge, right? So, I mean, this is looking at a supply chain check process, and a lot of the allocation checks, supply checks, order checks, availability checks can be dramatically reduced in terms of time, so that end users can really focus on important tasks rather than a lot of the kind of manual query tasks that the system actually knows already. And and that goes the same for financial use cases, whether it's looking at trying to reduce the risk of unpaid invoices, classifying the types of invoices that are high at risk, and then getting those addressed very quickly and providing the right information to the right end users is another example. I'm going very quickly. I apologize for this, but as I said, I'm happy to follow up at any other time. Whether it's cash accounts receivables, going through the Dunning process, automating payment advice extraction, matching with line items, all this kind of manual tasks where all the data is there and optimizing the output is there. And this is very, very kind of maybe low level, but deep down. But it also goes down to optimizing, kind of really key process, such as closing the books, right? Trying to provide the right information to the end users as they're trying to close the books, going through the consolidation process, making sure everything's in check for auditing, making sure everything's in check as you're going through disclosure management and presenting results if you're a public company, and so many other areas. But one of the key things we really have to make sure we're keeping in count is that the business data is, we're using relevant, right? It's got to be relevant to your business. We can't just ask general questions, right? Otherwise, we're not going to get, reliable AI output, because we're not training the data on information that is relevant. And the last thing that's important is responsibility, because we can't just let these systems just go completely unchecked. It's really important that there's always a human in the loop to make sure that the fine-tuning of these models is really working towards an outcome that is beneficial to all the relevant stakeholders, and not just for the machine itself, right? And then this is where I believe that this intelligence and these connected plans kind of benefits everyone, right? Everyone from corporate planning, where you're trying to optimize the allocation of resources, where you're trying to do quick business models, simulation, scenario evaluation, then through into kind of cross-line of business steering, where you're trying to understand how we're going to implement a specific decision. It might, capital budgeting might say, okay, we want to invest in this particular project. And then as it's executed, the cross-line of business steering will have the visibility across the business to understand, whether it's being executed in the right way. And then, information flows in both ways, right? It also then supports every employee in any line of business to help them take the right decisions. I can give you a very basic example. Imagine you're working in sales and for a complex product, say like a truck or something like that. And there's a customer that wants a large order. They say, can you deliver, 400 trucks? I mean, this may be an exaggeration, or let's say 100 trucks at this location, at this price, on this date, right? There are so many different variables that go into answering that question. And with the type of visibility we can get from building in the type of transparency we can get from a connected planning system, we can actually answer these questions, because you need to understand, okay, what do we have in inventory? Do we have the supplier? If we don't have the product in inventory, do we have the right materials sourced from the right suppliers to be able to build more of that product? Do we have, the right people in the factories or on the shop floor or in financing to be able to ensure that we can actually build and develop this product? Do we have the financing available to be able to make all the required purchasing? All these different questions, but actually the data is there in the system to give a very good answer and saying, like, within 90% probability, yes, we can actually deliver 100 trucks at this location at this price in this time frame, right? But today that can take months to be able to come back. And there are so many different, different use cases where this can be used, whether it's exploring new sales channels, understanding the impact of tax. Tax is one really important area, because a lot of the time we lose that transparency between what we look at the statutory level and then also the managerial level, right? So for example, when we're breaking down, I showed you earlier at the beginning of the presentation, where we break down corporate objectives into these KPIs that are set at the managerial level. But, imagine you're producing a car and you're taking the decision as like, do we produce this in country A or country B? And a lot of the time you've only got the information where you're optimizing profit without really taking into account the statutory impacts or the tax impacts that might be in place. So for example, a government might have incentives that might be around carbon or specific use of materials or specific suppliers where you get tax credits. And a lot of that time, that information gets lost, because when we break apart these different these KPIs, we lose that. And we need to be able to have that transparency between looking at it at a corporate level, at a statutory level, and then also at a managerial level, and understand the relationships between them. I go on. I mean, we've got M&A simulation where you can, automate pro forma, and to understand, what would be, how, viable it would be to maybe acquire a company or to merge with another company. And then, as I said, cross-line of business steering, whether you're looking at a central finance point of view, understanding, getting a group level picture of your finance, being able to do realistic product costing, so many different use cases. And then, as I said, right down to understanding impact and on any area of the organization. So whether you're on the shop floor and there might be a change in exchange rates for, that has an impact on a particular commodity, and you have to adjust somehow, we can actually have a system that provides that information to you to help with any operational decision support. And then that information rolls up to then the level 2, the cross line of business controlling support, and then into the executive. And you can really keep a track of projects and see how well things are going end to end. And, as I said, intelligent planning and really optimizing outcomes, it touches every area of the business, and it touches every technology. And so it's really important when you're trying to, work towards these type of intelligent systems, is really understanding which use cases are the most important for your business, right? Get buy-in in those use cases, understand the changes in processes that would need to take place to kind of get, your colleagues on board, prepare your data landscape. That's always important. Assess the modeling and requirements, make sure that there's an understanding to build that transparency across an organization. And I've touched a bit on the different planning levels, making sure that there's that transparency from level 1, 2, and 3, making sure that all the services that are being deployed are scalable, and then driving adoption and accelerating those planning cycles, to get that kind of high fidelity planning, as I like to call it. And with that, I'm at 25 minutes. I know that's an insane amount of information I've just run through very, very quickly, but we only had 25 minutes. As I said, I would be love to follow up with any of you at any time. Please feel free to reach out. And with that, we have 5 minutes for questions. So I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'm going to go and see if there are any questions in the chat. Right. So how are we coming up? Question 1. How can the CFO's office effectively bridge the gap between strategic planning and operational execution across various business units? Good question. I was hoping I'd answer that in the presentation. As I said, the important thing between the operational execution and strategic plan and the operational execution, I mentioned a few things. One thing is consistency in data structures, right? So that when you are moving strategic plan into the operational plan, there's a consistency in what you're looking at, right? So, for example, if you're developing a new product or a service, you might want to make sure that the identification or the master data, the ID number that is used on a future product, flows through into operational execution, so that there is a direct link, right, between what you're planning in the future and then what will then happen in execution. Also, setting up around processes, making sure that again, that you're getting the right people involved in the strategic plan. For those will then have to pass through into execution, right? So there's different levels as we move from strategic sales planning, financial planning, and then moving closer into kind of the execution of that strategic plan. There are kind of different steps and different personas that need to be involved, and making sure that the right people are in part of that process is super important. I know that's very, very quick question, answer that question, but there's quite a few I want to run through. What role does data transparency play in fostering trust and accountability across the enterprise? Huge. I mean, absolutely huge. And this data transparency also needs to come through in machine learning models as well, because if we're going to trust AI, for example, we need to understand why the result sets are coming back the way they do. And that's one of the biggest challenging. So transparency is super important. Data is super, super important. I cannot stress that enough. Because making sure that everyone can trust the data, that the data is up to date, right? That's why when you're working in Excel, it's always a bit tricky, because you take an export of data out of the system, you start working on it, you share it with someone else, but then, a day later that export is already out of date, and then you're not really working with live data. Obviously, you can't necessarily always work with 100% live data, but you want to get as close to that as possible. I don't know. And again, I could go on for that question for forever. Question 3, how can companies ensure that AI-enabled planning tools are accessible and user-friendly for employees across all levels of the organization? It's a really great question. What is really important is that the interfaces that we build, right, and especially when leveraging AI, are really integrated into the operational applications that we already use. Right. So we're not having to jump from one screen to another, trying to ask a question and somehow try and work that back into the tool that we're using. We want to make sure that the AI tools, or for example, the natural language assistants, are really built in and integrated into the application, so that they understand the context of when we're asking a question. And as I said, that business context, the context of who's the end user, what are they trying to achieve, what data is relevant for that specific query, is so important, which is why it needs to be embedded. And it's also super important why we need that additional context from other areas of business as well to get the right response back. Question 4. How can communication between finance, IT, and other departments be optimized to ensure that strategic objectives are met? Really good question. A lot of the time, the discussion between CFO and CTO is the CTO has an understanding of like how they're trying to optimize data, and they know that it will benefit finance in the end. But on the other side, finance are like, well, show me the real business value of this data, right? And there needs to be a translation between the kind of the two different departments, right, when trying to achieve these objectives. And I try and do that role as much as possible, bridge that gap between CTO and CFO by really showing, for example, give a really specific use case. Take working capital, for example, and you're trying to optimize working capital, and you're trying to understand, how to optimize payment terms for a specific supplier, or likewise on the DSO side, and having real tangible outputs that can be proven by the technology, that you could say, okay, we can improve our days sales outstanding by 1 day, but by implementing this technology, we can do this. Then you're making the output tangible to that specific user group, and that's really important. Yeah, and so I know I've been really super quick with an awful lot of material, and I've kind of brushed over these questions very quickly. As I said, I'm really happy to follow up at any other time. But with that, I'll hand it back to Nick. But it's been a pleasure speaking to you today. So thank you very much.
Great. And thank you, Michael, for such an incredible thought leadership. And I also want to thank everyone else for joining us today. This session, along with all of today's content, will be available on demand following the event. As a reminder, please be sure to check out the prizes and raffle rules section to see how you can earn points for the chance to win one of several prizes. Our next session will begin after our break at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, which will be a thought leadership titled Digitizing FP&A in 2025, Planning Automation and AI-Powered Outcomes. Please click the join button that will appear on your screen to be redirected to the next session, and we look forward to seeing you there.